Hello everyone. So I thought in the name of kind of like making things accessible to everyone, I wanted to do kind of like an audio run through of this introduction resource. I need to acknowledge right now that this may not stay always up to date because obviously the text post stuff is often updated more frequently, and I don't make any promises as to how frequently this is going to be updated in terms of the voice stuff. Um, the date today is the 25th of August, 2021. So that's when this was last updated, the voice audio thing anyway. So I suppose just going to start reading through it. Introductory voice training resources. This guide is for people who are interested in modifying the gender presentation of their voice in terms of finding a more neutral, fluid, non-binary voice. There's really no right way to do it, and I'm somewhat hesitant to pinpoint one type of androgyny. However, it can generally be found through selectively applying aspects of voice modification. I do want to say with that that voice modification for binary trans people is also not a linear one-to-one. This isn't actually in the post because I'm brushing up right against the kind of like word limit, so I can't actually add this in, but it's relevant, I think, so I'm just going to say that. And I also want to highlight that most of the teachers listed below are able to help with this, or they'll be able to kind of like direct people in the way of what they need. So I also want to acknowledge that this list of resources were curated by me, but not all of the videos and not all of the things that are actually created by me. In fact, most of the links to different things are not mine. So the first kind of like topic content table thing, right, that we see is recommended voice communities. So I kind of highlight that these are good communities for where places you can kind of like work on your voice. That's kind of like the main reason these are pasted there. There's also kind of like resources to look over in some of them, whether that's recordings of previous lessons with other people or workshops, lessons you can listen in on, or group workshops you can attend. So the first server in there is actually the one that's mine. So the Discord link is in the post. I don't think I'm going to read out Discord links because that would be a painful experience for me, and I don't think it'd be super useful. But I want to highlight that my server has an archive of past lesson recordings and workshop recordings, and also has a number of auditable/public lessons you can listen in on. The next server is Savvy's with a similar setup to mine. The next server is Online Vocal Coach. Hearth teaches on that server. There's a lot of public lessons to listen in on, and also a workshop once a week. The next server is Fluid Voice Studio. It's a community server focused on kind of like working on voice. There's also a number of group workshops. The next server is Singuistics. Singuistics is a server dedicated to singing, science, and linguistics. It's a community where there's a fair number of kind of like events and voice chats where you can work on your voice. And an honorable mention to the Trans Voice Lessons server. If you're familiar with Ziana from anywhere else, or her videos will be later linked in this guide. It's currently a paywalled server, so it's not linked, but it may also be worth having a look at. So the first topic is a SoundCloud link, on like the next topic, is voice masculinization. In there is an audio clip that leads you to a place where you can work on where it kind of gives you an introduction to voice masculinization, or like working on finding more masculine qualities in your voice. It generally focuses on three things. It introduces them. So pitch, you may already be familiar with. High pitch, low pitch. Also not isolating that, so there was other stuff changing. Pitch is hard to isolate without modifying other things, because it is something that's very tied into the other stuff. The other two variables are resonance and vocal weight. So resonance changing might sound something like this, kind of going from a more femme sound to like a more masc sound by changing the volume of the vocal tract. And the next one is vocal weight, so that kind of like changing on its own. where it's more intense, it's a heavier vocal weight. And there's also cultural factors that play a role in how people perceive voice, but I won't be touching on this too much here, as it is a thing that people probably want to pick up from people around them, or work on with relation to voice goals, because these things can differ by a range of factors, including location, age group, and all that kind of stuff. So those are things to keep in mind. There's not very many resources on voice masculinization, but going to workshops might be a good way to practice that. The next category is voice feminization, or working on finding a more feminine voice. What's listed here is a number of videos relating to kind of like getting started, and there's also a text post. So this text post references one of the videos. The Big Picture of Voice Feminization is an introductory resource and discusses things like forming a productive mindset and the factors that are involved in gendering voice. You may think it less relevant, but it does lay the groundwork for the overall process. The following videos are generally focused on individual variables and exercise, and I would encourage you to try these exercises as you go along. These videos can lay it on pretty thick, so don't feel too bad if it's overwhelming. The science is good, but very in-depth. Understanding is not required to make progress, but it can help. If you are looking for somewhere to get started, then I recommend Zia's recent beginner video. So just going through that. I want to highlight that we don't want to place too much emphasis on individual variables, as often in isolation they don't make a lot of difference. So if I start kind of modifying these in a range, so the pitch is higher here and the vocal weight is lower, but it sounds pretty masc, or like sounds atypical at least.
If I start raising resonance, then this gets into a pretty decent space. If I get heavier, then it still sounds feminine, but it sounds kind of like shouty, right?
And these are things that we just need to be mindful of, right? When we're kind of modifying voice.
Sound like this. It's very low, but also it sounds somewhat androgynous. I've not actually mimicked this voice in a while, so it may not be a perfect mimicry.
But what I want to highlight is just that there's a range in which voices can exist in, and oftentimes you get the voices and the vibes you want by using a mix and match of the variables. So here we can see linked is a couple of videos kind of like talking about different people to different voices, right? I also write some stuff about how any guides using swallow and hold as a exercise beyond exploration can be pretty harmful. I would encourage you to stay away from those. The next category is text-based guides. So there's my old guide. I don't really recommend it anymore. It has some exercise to play around with, but I don't really stand by it anymore. It's just up there while I'm writing a more up-to-date version. Al's Guides is a nice guide for exploration, but I don't think it's like a perfect guide or anything like that. And then we have Romeo's Guide, which is a guide focusing on trans voice masculinization. So the next category of things is vocal health. So intro to vocal health, general tips, VFEs, softies, and spelling checks. General things we ought to do for vocal health and vocal hygiene. Sleep. No, I'm not kidding. When we sleep, we give our vocal folds a good chance to recover from a taxing day of speech they've just endured. And if you're doing vocal training, it's fairly likely that you're engaging in some taxing behaviors at some point. Stay hydrated. Hydration is important for maintaining vocal health. If we produce sounds while our vocal folds are dehydrated, it's more likely to lead to fatigue. And also, if we are generally not looking after our voices, it's more likely that we're going to incur permanent vocal damage. This is not something that's often coming from a one-off event, but that is not to say that you can't do that. Maintaining vocal health is a sustained effort. It's not a sprint. You can't just, focus on making your voice good one day and then to treat it like trash the rest of the time. Another thing that you might want to focus on is acid reflux. If you get acid reflux, trying to avoid this is pretty important. See if you can find triggers, see if you can get some help with removing that. The second part of this this post of the vocal health stuff goes into vocal function exercises and semi-occluded vocal tract exercises. There is a SoundCloud link that you can click, which takes you to more detailed stuff here. Then there is a list of recommended vocal function exercises. Vocal function exercises are really good for maintaining vocal health, but also helping you get better control of your voice, whether that's achieving thin or thick configurations or improving consistency. There is an example suggested here which goes into further detail in the SoundCloud link, but the general gist is going from highest to lowest, lowest to highest on a softy, and then again on a softy, maintaining a medium pitch, choosing some notes that are in a comfortable range for you, and just trying to sustain a medium loud sound. So an example of a softy in this scenario might be like a lip trill, right? And then we'll go through once again on a softer sound, sustaining on a softy, targeting a softer sound. So that might be more like, right? And my voice feels a little bit fatigued right now because I just did a workshop. Then there is a diagram noting kind of like different sounds we could use, with some descriptions of what the sounds are. I'll just go through that now. M, M, N, N, sorry. The next icon looks like an It's actually an U. You've got a large straw. Z. Then you've got a Z. Then you've got a J from genre or beige. J. Then you've got tongue trill. Right. Then you've got a V. 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 It's kind of like if you had a B but then turned it into a V. Your lips are together but your teeth aren't involved. Then you have a V. V. Then you have a lip trill. Then you have a small straw. Then you have a raspberry, which I'm not going to demo, and then you have straw and water, which I'm also not going to demo. So another thing to consider may be swelling checks. Swelling checks can be a good way to keep track of your vocal health. I don't personally do them. They can be pretty good if you're generally keyed into keeping your vocal health good. Similarly, there is a link to Ziana's false fold control post. Oftentimes when we feel fatigued, it's something to do related to the behaviors we've been using, and oftentimes false fold engagement is a trigger for that. The next category is teacher recommendations. The first kind of like the part of the post is comments on why there's no SLPs in the post. The reason that is mainly because most SLPs don't know what the fuck they're talking about. They try to pathologize voice. Trans voices are not typically disordered, right? They are not going to a speech therapist to get undisordered voices. They're going to a speech therapist to modify the presentation of their voice. The SLP skill set is not very suited to this, as they don't really understand that the aim is not to minimize any risk of harm all the time, but actually to change the presentation, and don't really understand the kind of like harm reduction aspect of voice training, because obviously if our voices are not congruent with our identity, that can create dysphoria, not always, but can also make us feel like trash. So that's why that's in there. It's kind of like going to a physiotherapist to get dancing lessons. My mum is a physio. I would not recommend going to her for dance lessons. Not that SLPs are necessarily experts in trans voice, but they can be quite good if you have vocal fatigue. In this list of recommended teachers right now, there's about 7 people, or 8 or 9, I'm not quite sure, but the contact details in there and stuff is pretty good. I'm not going to go through these one by one, as they aren't so much, because they might change, they're subject to change. This list might change a lot, and also pricing. I don't want to be responsible for directing people with the wrong pricing, and there's also a lot to say about each of them. I mean, shamelessly plug myself. If you want lessons with me, I'm in there. It will. My prices are changing from when they're in there, so I'm not going to comment on those. If underneath in the thing that says people having audible lessons or private public lessons, that means that there's a lesson between a teacher and a student you can listen on. And workshops are time where often they'll have an intro, and then you can have some one-on-one time with people, with a teacher, getting help on and feedback on your voice. The next category is things to be mindful of. So the first one is just kind of highlighting that we don't want to use head voice or falsetto, typically speaking, if we're trans femme, because most women's voices aren't based up there. You know, you will get some exceptions. People like Lily Pichu or like anime girl voices might often use them too, but that's not typical of most women's speech, and therefore we probably, for the most part, don't want to base our voices up there. It goes into some more detail about kind of like the mechanics of speech, which I don't think are super necessary. I also want to highlight the importance of things like swallow and hold not being a good exercise. I did that previously, but it can actually lead to fatigue and strain, which we don't want. And it can also just make it harder to use the voice we want in the end. We shouldn't push the larynx. You know, modifying larynx position is a part of modifying resonance in the voice. Whether that's kind of like going for a low resonance
or whether that's going for a higher resonance, right?
But we shouldn't ever be pushing the larynx. We shouldn't be trying to push it down.
We shouldn't be trying to push it up,
right? Because that's harmful, and also is an incomplete picture. It's best to focus on sound qualities when going for these movements because it's going to be more relevant. The next one is discussing surgery. Because that might be a trigger for some people, I'm not going to bring it up, but generally surgery isn't necessary to modify voice, and it's also not good typically in terms of prospects as relating to training. It will often limit you in terms of what you can do when it relates to kind of like modifying the voice further, whether that's going higher or lower. It can also, you know, in unfortunate cases lead to loss of function in an extreme way or pain, even if initially you do get good results. So the next part of that post is talking about resonance. When I talk about resonance, I mean, you know, changing the amount of space in the vocal tract so you get a perceived change in the gender presentation, right? If a guide starts saying push your resonance forward or project your resonance from the mask or anything like that, that's a sign that that guide is shit. Just throw it out. You know, for some people stuff like that might work, but it's actually pretty inconsistent between person to person, and I wouldn't encourage you to think about resonance in that way. We shouldn't really be focusing on where we feel vibrations in our bodies because it does typically lead us astray. The next point in this is thing is for my trans masks. It's a subheading basically of the previous one. We shouldn't really be worrying about where we feel vibrations. You know, if I'm making it sound like this, I feel vibrations in my chest.
If I'm making it sound like this, I feel vibrations in my chest.
Right? That is not very transferable, and we shouldn't feel caught up in where we feel vibrations from. We feel vibrations in places because the air is moving and also our vocal folds are vibrating, right? It is a vibrating air column, right? The one place where, you know, you might feel vibrations consistently between person to person is if, like, the voice goes nasal, right? So if you have a nasality issue, or you have, like, nasality in your voice by default, then you're gonna have some vibration in your nose, right? And we're not really going for this. Nasality is not the aim of the game when it comes to, like, feminizing or masculinizing the voice. It can be used to kind of, like, shoot for certain vocal qualities. Oftentimes it has a slightly darkening feature, and, you know, you will see it come up in some guys' voices.
And, you know, you'll also see it come up in some kind of, like, you know, femme voices, right? Yeah, so you might see kind of, like, some nasality and twang come in at the same time.
And that is something that might come up, but it's not kind of like default thing, right? The next kind of topic is over-dependence on spectrograms. Generally speaking, spectrograms can be a useful tool in voice training, but I wouldn't advocate for them as the tool we use. I think I go into a little bit of kind of description on why that is. and there's also some resources for kind of avoiding that. Oftentimes, the fact spectrograms can be useful for monitoring that pitch is where we want it to be. If I'm doing an exercise like
then what I want to do is be mindful that my pitch is in the same place. And, I can check that that's the case by looking at
where the pitch is lying on the spectrogram. If I'm doing that and I notice that the line's fine, then that's good. If I'm doing right, I might notice that the pitch is modifying, and that's a sign, that's a thing we want to be mindful of. It can also be good for sometimes looking at how much vocal weight we've got, but oftentimes it's just easier to listen for that. So the next topic is pitch monitoring app and other voice apps, right? Pitch is definitely not the most important variable as it relates to gender perception and voice. So, resonance modification is much more important. And also the amount of vocal weight. So, if your vocal weight's doing fine, then you're probably alright, right? Vocal weight and resonance is probably where we want to focus most of our energy. The one time when, in my opinion, pitch monitoring apps become useful is if we're trying to kind of like isolate pitch out of the picture and try to modify other things. So whether that's changing vocal weight. I wonder if I think my pitch did roughly say the same. Yeah, there was a little bit of wobble. But, that's probably one of the times, and also when we're changing resonance and making sure that it's staying in the right place. That's really the only time when I'd expect it to come up as useful. Or if you're kind of like having trouble kind of sustaining the pitch you're at when you're kind of doing the stuff, it's all right to have, a little bit of kind of like pitch variation. It can actually be a pretty normal feature in like some older people's voices, so if they're kind of, like in this range, or let me think. He's dangerous to you now. Do you understand? Go home. Right? So a sound like this with a little bit of false constriction. There's plenty more like him in the east and west wing. The pitch here is fairly low. And you might see the pitch kind of drift down sometimes. And then it might go a little bit higher sometimes. Right? In older women's voices, or more kind of various voices like that, you might see some pitch drift. Consistency is maybe another time when you might want to look at pitch, but using your ears is much better because how people gender voices is based on the vibe and not individual qualities at X value, right? So the next thing I want to talk about is the idea that X thing is harmful or X thing is bad. What I talk about here is whether high larynx postures and vocal fry are dangerous. They're not, inherently. There is ways that you can have a higher larynx and do stuff that's bad.
Like a sound like this is pretty indicative of some kind of like strain going on, right? And some people introduce jaw tension and stuff like that, or tongue tension. These kind of things are just things we want to be mindful of, because otherwise they can kind of like lead to some fatigue, right? So that's just one thing to be mindful of. I really fucking hope I'm recording. I am. So that's one thing to be mindful of. Vocal fry as well. It's perfectly fine. It's a pretty common feature in many people's voices. We can make fry sounds which are indicative of kind of like false fold engagement, and sometimes vocal fry will just include false fold engagement. We only want to worry about fry if it's fatiguing, right? If we're finding that it's making us fatigued, then stop it. But if not, then you're Gucci. The next kind of bullet point is intonation, inflection, and prosody. I just highlight that these factors are essentially cultural. The example I used here is like the vocal recipe underneath. Whether that is resonance or pitch or like whatever being lower or higher, right? Or higher. If I speak like a robot and don't change very many things, then the gender perception of the voice will still be audible, right? But these factors like intonation, inflection, and prosody are like social icings on the cake, so to say. If you have chicken soup versus tomato soup, right? It doesn't matter how much kind of like
intonation you throw on top, how much salt and pepper you throw on top, the kind of like makeup of the soup is what's important. And obviously we can modify these things through behavioral modifications, like I've kind of demonstrated right now. And normally people are probably capable of a wider range of things than they realize. And obviously I do want to highlight that a lot of my fem sounds are not always as polished as you might want them to be. And that is because I haven't spent the time to like create or like conceptualize what I want a fem voice for me to sound like. Because I'm an indecisive bitch. What? Who said that? So the next kind of thing I want to talk about is smiling. So smiling is something that we can use, but we don't want to make it a basis of our voice, right? So if I've kind of got a femme sound and like really kind of like really, really smiley, right, then, it's all right. It might kind of sound more femme in some ways, but what it sounds like? It really just sounds, sorry, what it sounds like? It really just sounds like I'm smiling. If I purse my lips like this, then it doesn't really change the gender perception too much. It just sounds like whether I'm smiling or whether I'm pursing my lips. So that's something we want to kind of like be mindful of, right? If you smile, it sounds like you're smiling. And sometimes that ain't appropriate. Sometimes, somebody just died, if there's a funeral, we don't want to make smiling an integral part of whether we pass or not. The next thing I want to confront is the idea that you have to use one voice all the time. Obviously, you can hear that I kind of like move through a range of voices, right? Obviously, that was a little bit over the top. But, normally people use their voices in a pretty fluid way. And even if it's like a case of shifting goals, you're allowed to have shifting goals. Like, I don't know what to say beyond that. Like, you don't have to choose one voice. You can honestly like maintain multiple attractive states, whether that's
I'll never forget what I saw. Children playing in the fields.
He's dangerous to you now, do you understand? Go home. There's plenty more like him in the east and west wing.
Yeah, so like, I'm just chilling, with the boys, gonna crack open a cold one.
There's lots of different ways that we can like develop, like conceptualize the attractive states of different voices. And we're not limited to using any particular one of these, right? We can play around in a range with lots and lots of different ones, right? And the other thing is, right, there's no pressure to like decide on what you want your voice to sound like, whether that's in 5 years from now or 10 minutes from now, right? Just have fun, explore, and see if you can have as much fun as possible. That's my opinion, right? So the next point is talking about the effect of sex hormones on your voice. Estrogen post first puberty doesn't have a lot of impacts. In first puberty, it does slightly lengthen and thicken the vocal folds. Testosterone in first puberty tends to result in, so if I'm here, right, it tends to result in the vocal tract getting bigger, which is kind of like a modification in this direction. You also expect the vocal folds to get longer, so this kind of like encourages some kind of like, lowering pitch. And then you get one more kind of change in that front, and that's a thickening of the vocal folds. And, that kind of results in a slightly lower voice, right, further from when we started. And it also tends to lead to a slight kind of like decrease in pitch and increase in kind of intensity, right? So when we conceptualize the changes we want to kind of like create in voice, we want to kind of like use these physiological sex markers in voice as a guiding post for what we want to modify, right? One final note to note on testosterone, it can lead to ossification of the larynx in transmasculine people if their starting dosage is too high.
And sometimes that like leads to a voice like this, which is like a totally valid goal, but like, the resonance could do with it being a little bit lower depending on where you live. So that really kind of depends. So the final kind of topic point here is keeping voice where you want it.
This may be related to kind of like, whether you're kind of like drifting after a little bit, kind of like going down, right? There might also be like, in certain scenarios, whether you kind of like just drop down when you're kind of like speaking to different people. getting people to be mindful of your voice, or trying to be mindful of your own voice, getting better at hearing stuff, can be a great way to know if you're kind of drifting. So if I'm up here, right, and I'm trying to like go through the kind of like motions of speaking, right, if I start kind of like dropping things down, then if I kind of get more used to listening to what it sounds like, then I might be able to kind of like do it. Another thing to do might be like conceptualize the perfect version of your voice in your head, or like the voice that you kind of like want to go with, right? And then if you find like that's drifting wherever that voice is, then you can like just stop, take a stock moment. During this thing, I've been using some stock phrases, right? Like, he's dangerous to you now, do you understand?
I'll never forget what I saw, children playing in the fields. And, what I'm doing here is kind of using these attractor states, these kind of like memorized passages, to kind of like bolster me into the place where I need to go to get these voices.
So if I go through the idea of kind of like that I'll never forget what I saw voice in my head,
then, I might be able to kind of like jump out to exactly where I want it, right? Because I've kind of got this kind of like clear conception of the vibe I'm going for.
right? And you'll probably hear that sound as somewhat androgynous. Different people hear different things. Some people hear like grandma voice, other people hear like that's an atypical voice, and don't really think about it much further, right? So seeing if you can get used to talking to people in a variety of situations, even if that's just a difference between sitting down and standing up. These two kind of like different postures and different things can actually throw together quite a lot of like when we kind of use our voices in a more varied way, it can actually throw us off a little bit. So that's something to be mindful of, and trying to work into practice where possible, right? I wouldn't recommend it, but if you really want to, you could try your voices out in CSGO. So the next kind of category is dealing with family or dealing with like people you live with when practicing. This category is reasonably big, but I think it's a pretty good one because a lot of people struggle with this. So dealing with family that makes you, or people you live with that make you feel not good about sort of voice training, or self-conscious, or just kind of like get you up in your head, or are unaccepting, can be pretty annoying, right? If it's safe, then my advice is really try to get over it. If you don't get along great with your family, right, and they wouldn't hate crime you for like doing this stuff or something like that, right, you can actually start to view voice training as a fuck you kind of thing, like middle finger, like playing around with stuff, right? If our barrier is ourselves, then sometimes like deliberately leaning into cringe stuff, or like things that we think is cringe, right? Like leaning into cartoon character voices, or like modifying the sound of your voice, right, in whatever way, right? And you kind of like, you might feel like doing exercises cringe or something, right? Try to be more varied, try to like get over it, because that's the only way really that you kind of like start to feel better about this stuff. There's not like a switch, The next thing I want to kind of like highlight is that if it's not safe to kind of like practice in around of your family, this is a different story, right? I don't want you to get in danger. So in these scenarios, trying to find opportunities when people are asleep, out. If you can go somewhere else, like a friend's house who's supportive, a different kind, like go for a walk, all these different things, get out in nature. All of these ways can be ways that you can practice. And the other thing I want to highlight in this vein is kind of like, or if you drive somewhere, if you've got a car, cars tend to have good soundproofing and to provide an opportunity where you can practice. All these options exist. Things you can do quietly, things like, voiceless resonance manipulation, right? Preferably using something like a brown noise generator on your phone, kind of like modifying resonance, whether that's like, right? Preferably, not my preference when coming to this stuff, if you do it like that, but if you can, kind of focusing on specific vowels like right? Practicing like that, being mindful that false hold constriction is not something we want to carry over.
You could also play around with trying to raise up the back of your tongue and kind of like shrink the space at the back of your mouth if you're trans femme, or doing the opposite if you're trans masc. If you're trans masc, another one kind of like opens itself up to you, yawning. Taking this kind of like expansion feeling can be pretty good to kind of like find a more masc sound. And if I start like lowering pitch and increasing vocal weight with this, then it sounds very typical all of a sudden, right? Expanding pitch range when looking to kind of like find more masc stuff, going down in a soft sound like is often very quiet, can also be a good way to just train finding lower pitches, right? Also, finding soft sounds like is something that oftentimes isn't super overhearable, and also is a decent way of practicing that and getting you ready for stuff. Things we can kind of like get prying other people to kind of like go away with if they're not kind of like dangerous but just kind of like intrusive. Passing things off as like voice acting interest, say it's character voice for D&D, suggesting it's part of singing if you have ever shown an interest in that. Passing it off as just making noises for fun, because lots of people do that. Other options, playing music, doing it in a kind of like small space, a closet or something where sound is dampened. All these options might be things to play around with. So I haven't got anything else to say right now other than obligatory. If you want to book a lesson with me, then my details can be found in the post. But aside from that, I hope this intro to this post gave you some stuff to kind of like work on and be mindful of. And hopefully you have good luck in your process of learning how to modify voice. If you're trans femme, I would recommend starting with the Zia's beginner video, First Steps Trans Femme video. It's not actually called that on my channel, but that is what I've titled it here. So anyway, I will catch you all later, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.